Welcome, evolution and human behavior students, to this hopefully somewhat short lecture about modularity and the mind and some things, a little bit about cognition and emotions. Now, there's a lot to say about these subjects within the world of both biology and psychology, so I'm really giving this the short shrift. But partly what I wanted to do in this lecture is to review some concepts about adaptations, about the fact that we make some assumptions about adaptations and adaptive thinking. I'm also going to talk about some of the fields that have contributed to looking at the evolution of human behavior, including evolutionary psychology, but also a group of other fields, sometimes called human behavioral ecology, sometimes called sociobiology, human ethology, Darwinian anthropology, and we're going to kind of lump all those other ones together, and you'll see what I mean in a minute here. Okay, but let me start with reviewing some of the cautions that we talked about in class, and one of those was if the behavior exists, it must be adaptive. And if you're looking at behaviors as and assuming that they're adaptations, then we really need to be able to demonstrate that. And it's useful in order to think about adaptations in order to generate hypotheses. Remember that scientists make observations and generate hypotheses. And so adaptive thinking can help us suggest certain hypotheses. Like you might say, for example, that male uncertainty about their paternity leads to mate guarding and jealousy. All right, and one of the things that we can say about this is that by making this guess is that we've sort of suggested a hypothesis that we might too easily automatically just assume is the case, okay, especially because we might observe mate guarding and jealousy and then assume that it's paternity uncertainty that has caused it. But on the other hand, there can be this other approach that we might refer to as reverse engineering, okay, just by looking at this in the reverse, okay? And so in this case, we might observe jealousy as a behavioral trait amongst people, and then ask the question, what were the selective forces and what were the environmental conditions that may have led to jealousy? Okay, and it may seem like I'm saying the same thing, but the fact is that if you start with coming up with an automatic explanation without testing it, then you can actually end up neglecting some important evidence that doesn't support your idea, because you're assuming, oh, well, it must be male uncertainty about their paternity, and then you don't look at other kinds of things that might be involved. So this diagram, I'm sorry that it's a little bit blurry, but this diagram kind of summarizes what we were talking about, the difference here. And this says here, start here. And for someone that's going to utilize this sort of reverse engineering approach, you would start with a current understanding or theoretical thinking about certain discoveries or current mental mechanisms and their functions. And we're going to describe what that means a little bit more later. But you start with the idea that there are some certain mechanisms, and then you might infer that the problems that the mental mechanisms were designed to solve, okay, and then you would end up with maybe that would give us information about the problems that are faced by our ancestors in their environment, okay, and this is sort of opposite again to if you start at this place, if this is your start where you say, okay, what are the problems that our ancestors faced? Like it was cold, all right? And then we would say, all right, well, let's infer some solutions by adaptive thinking and say, well, maybe they needed to develop some fur on their bodies or hair, okay? And then we would say, all right, our current understanding is that, humans have hair on their bodies as mammals, okay? So that's kind of the opposite of saying, okay, well, we observe something like fur and then make an inference to saying perhaps it had to do with the cold environment. All right, so they're related, but again, it's sort of a back and forth kind of approach. And what what I want to kind of give to you as a bottom line here is that it's really this reverse engineering thinking that can be a little bit less biased because we don't ignore evidence that may be important. And that certain fields like psychology, in particular evolutionary psychology, have tended to emphasize adaptive thinking, although evolutionary psychologists are diverse and that you'll see people that may utilize both. So as I've mentioned earlier, we're really going to look at evolutionary psychology as a subfield of the evolution of human behavior versus human behavioral ecology, often referred to as Darwinian anthropology. And I've mentioned you may also see things like sociobiology or human sociobiology, rather, in this category. You may see human ethology. Let's put human over here too. Human ethology in this category. And there may be a couple of other subcategories, but for the most part, I'm going to refer to them here as human behavioral ecology, or HBE, just to abbreviate that, versus evolutionary psychology, or EP. Okay? Before we get started on our comparison or description of these fields, let's start with the idea of something that both fields talk about in different ways, and that's the idea that our brains are modular. And so what do we mean by this modular brain concept? Okay, so we know that there are different components of the brain that can deal with different sorts of specific functions. And for certain kinds of functions, this may be a little bit more known than other functions. Things like vision, which can be in the back of the brain here, hearing, language, speech, and these can relate generally to the lobes of the brain, which are a lot more easy to identify: the cerebellum, the motor cortex area, the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe. There are many other areas of the brain. And again, this is not a class in brain physiology, so I don't want to get too deep into this. But the idea that we might map out certain parts of the brain that have to do with specific functions when it comes to more complex behaviors, okay, so when it becomes to more complex behaviors, is kind of a question mark, okay? Sensations, specific emotions. Again, there are certain areas that have been mapped with certain kinds of things, but the extent to which we can do this may be different for higher level kinds of processes. One sort of fun way that you can actually see evidence for the fact that humans have perceptual modules are by looking at some of these optical illusions. And maybe some of you guys have seen this one before. It's kind of famous. It's called the Adelson checkered square illusion. And again, this relates to the idea that we have certain modules in our brains to do certain functions. And this has perhaps an adaptive function because we can do things much more efficiently by having an area in the brain that can respond really quickly. Okay? And so, for example, in this optical illusion, you see that there's this square here that's labeled as A, okay, and this square here is labeled as B. And in fact, the squares A and B are shaded by the exact same color. It's the same shade of gray. And if you're looking at it like me, you'll say, well, it certainly doesn't seem that way. A looks a lot darker than B. And in fact, that's what your brain is telling you to see. Okay? But if you take this illusion and test that hypothesis, there's a couple things you could do. You could take the original diagram and print it out on a piece of paper. Okay, good quality would be good. And then cut out the A, cut out the B, take them out of this context, and line them up next to each other. And you'll see that they're both the same shade of gray. Okay, over here what they've done is they've taken two strips of gray vertical stripes that are of the same exact shade of gray. So the stripes are the same shade of gray from top to bottom. And when you put them along the A and B, you can see that it looks like the same next to A and the same next to B, even though A still might look a little bit darker. And this is one way to prove that they're actually the same shade. Okay, so what's going on here is that our brain is more interested in categorization and looking at general ideas than to be a specific barometer of light level differences. And what's additionally interesting is that it doesn't really matter how much we're logically aware, even though you're told, and you can prove it to yourself, you can cut these out, even though you're told that they're different, you still can't see them as different. I know that when I look at it, A still looks darker than B to me. So even though I have the experience, even though I have the knowledge, even though I have the cognition that those two are definitely the same shade, I still don't see them as different. So the question for evolutionary psychologists and for other investigators of the evolution of human behavior are questions like, are higher level functions like reasoning modular? Some people would say that they are, and we just need to locate and discover those modules, and we need to do more research on that. And other people would say that these kinds of higher level functions are beyond the identification of specific modules. Let's take up that idea a little bit more specifically here. When we think about the human mind and how it's evolved, one of the things that we want to think about is, what was the human mind designed to comprehend? And this cartoon's kind of funny here because we sort of see that all of these so-called lower, and lower is kind of not really a good term, but these other organisms from which we evolved, not necessarily in a linear fashion like this, but the idea that animals have all been driven by the need to eat, survive, reproduce, right? And then we have the human here saying, what's it all about? Are we really all that different? Haven't humans been subjected to the same kinds of selection pressures such that our brains want to try to solve these particular problems?